I walked across campus to visit my colleague Rick Vatz. Dr. Vatz has been with Towson over 41 years. I wanted to talk with him about an article he'd recently had published in the American Spectator titled "End Student Evaluations of Professors." And the subtitle was "An Appeal for Courage in the Academy."
The famous Holocaust survivor who passed in the last couple of years, who we got to speak at Towson when we used to get a lot of good speakers at Towson, and he was just brilliant and one of the most moving people that I've met in my entire life. Bob Ehrlich has spoken to my class for over a quarter century, twice a year. He's a politician who is, in my view, one of the most honest, decent, highest integrity individuals I've ever met, and you don't normally find that among the politicians in our country. That's a fake picture, but I won the first SJ Teacher of the Year award at Towson University, and Jan Lucas in University Relations made that up for me. And she, by the way, is retiring, and she's one of the best employees Towson has ever had. She's just wonderful. Well, I think that one of the premises that I wrote on is the fact that professors are afraid of students, and they're afraid of other professors who want to include student opinions as a major criterion for their promotion, their tenure, their reappointment. And the fact is that we use student evaluations more and more as a relevant measure of whether a professor is doing a good job or not. And I think that teaching evaluations are almost now completely invalid.
But you say fear. You use another word. You say fear.
Sure, I see professors who talk with students, and students have objections about something in the course, and the professors yield almost automatically because they're afraid that this will hurt their teaching evaluations. As a matter of fact, there are some professors who have midterm teaching evaluations that are not included in the materials they turn in at the end of the term, and they have these evaluations because they want to find out what they can do to ensure that students will have a good time in their class. So students may write, I think you give too many tests. I think that I'm not sure about some of the concepts on the harder points you're talking about. So the teachers then say, well, I'll give easier. I will do with easier points, and I'll give tests that have a curve in which more people get B's and A's. They're so afraid of students, and they shouldn't be.
Is there a specific, without naming names, can you take me a particular flashing moment image that you have of that?
I guess I could think of a professor who says to me, my students appear to be unhappy with the class.
This actually happened?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think, the teacher is speaking, I generally give interim measures of why they're unhappy.
Yeah. And why did they come to you, by the way?
Yeah, because I may have been talking about it, I may have been talking about a group, and I'll say to them, well, so what? If they're unhappy, does that mean that it's a poor pedagogical method? Why would you change something just because students are unhappy? Sometimes students are unhappy, and it turns out it's the best thing for them.
Will students be able to appreciate a sort of academic tough love in the moment?
Well, I might give a test at the beginning of a term.
Right.
And I may have some students who really don't do well. And their initial question is, what can I do to raise my grade? And I'll tell them, well, that's not the issue. The issue is, what can you do to better understand the material? Because the material is very important.
Right.
Now that creates a little bit of dissension. And sometimes students will say to me, who have gotten bad grades on a test and then a major paper, they'll say, what can I do to raise my grade? May I do an extra paper? And I'll say, no, you may not do an extra paper. There are certain criteria that I grade by, and everybody has the same criteria. If I allow you to do an extra paper, I have the obligation to allow everybody to do an extra paper. And what if they want another paper beyond that?
Well, and there's a mismatch of motivators, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, what you want is for them to master this particular area and body of knowledge, to come into some understanding. Maybe it's also to gain an appreciation and enthusiasm, if not master the knowledge. And they may also have that initially or fleetingly, but they're also coming with these really practical demands from parents, from their own situations. I've got to wind up with a certain grade point average, or I've got to wind up with a certain grade in this class, or whatever.
Yes. A student will say to me, I've got to get an A or a B in this class because of my scholarship. And I'll say, that is not for me to consider. I've got to judge you on how well you do in the class.
There is a presumption that the professor, that the professor's course, the material, the pacing, the workload, the delivery is
negotiable.
I guess you're putting the point on it, is that not just that, but that it's negotiable.
Yeah.
And in the terms of the way evaluations are working, that negotiation goes from the student to the PTRM committee.
Right, exactly.
Either your peers or up to your college level or whatever, being used for evaluation purposes and stuff like that. That really is kind of the where it rubs here, is these evaluations being used for, or in any way impinging on PTRM deliberations. Right. And I'm just gonna read from what you wrote, because I think this is good here. So I'm jumping in mid-sentence, and you say, I'm paraphrasing, if anything, the current student evaluation, should be replaced by student accounts of measurable teacher behaviors on which students have the ability to report with some accuracy and validity. And you go on to write, for example, does the professor show up for class regularly? Does he or she arrive on time? Does he or she grade consistently with his or her claims of criteria?
There are many, many students who, after a class has expired 5 years, 10 years, will say, there's a teacher that I really had who taught me a lot. I can tell by my situation in my job. There's a professor I had who really helped me, and I didn't realize it until 5 or 10 years later. And that happens a lot. But they can't know it at the completion of the course, and yet we assume that the student has this great perspicacious way of ascertaining whether the professor's a good professor.
Right.
And so they can't go back 10 years later and say, by the way, I'd like to redo that evaluation. By then the professor may have been promoted or fired.